a aussi insulté tous les Africains.
Je crois qu'on a oublié de nous dire merci. C'est pas grave, ça viendra avec le temps.
Il y a une partie qui a retenu mon attention, là où il parlait d'ingratitude.
L'ingratitude, je suis bien placé pour le savoir.
The story broke with the kind of shock usually reserved for natural disasters or political assassinations. One announcement from Niamey sent ripples all the way to Paris. Niger was cutting off all uranium exports to France. At first, it sounded like another round of rhetoric from the Sahel's defiant military governments. But this time it wasn't bluster. Border shipments were frozen. Contracts were annulled. French mining operations were effectively seized overnight. Orano, France's state-owned nuclear giant, watched helplessly as over $200 million worth of uranium sat immobilized in Niger's soil. The images told their own story. French trucks sat idle in the desert heat, guarded not by company security, but by the soldiers of Niger's junta. Contracts that had once been rubber-stamped in Paris were now nothing more than scraps of paper. French officials, who just months earlier had dismissed Niger's junta as a temporary inconvenience, suddenly faced a logistical nightmare. In Paris, the shock was immediate. Emergency meetings at the Élysée Palace stretched late into the night. Energy executives briefed ministers on worst-case scenarios. The stock of Orano, already fragile after years of declining influence in Africa, sank even further. Newspapers screamed of an energy crisis in the making. Commentators compared the move to the 1973 oil embargo, when OPEC punished the West and sent fuel prices soaring. But this time it wasn't oil. It was uranium, the hidden lifeblood of France's nuclear economy. The panic wasn't just about raw material. It was about symbolism. For decades, France had projected itself as the world's model of energy independence. Unlike Germany or Italy, it didn't have to fear Russian pipelines or Middle Eastern oil wars. Nuclear reactors spread across French territory gave Paris the reputation of self-reliance. But the sudden loss of Niger's uranium pulled back the curtain on that narrative. Even France's most prized strength depended on African soil. Meanwhile, in Niamey, the announcement was delivered with a tone of finality. The junta declared that French mining rights, secured during decades of post-colonial dominance, were revoked. Niger's uranium, they insisted, would now serve the nation's development or be sold to partners offering better terms. France's energy crown jewel had been turned into a bargaining chip. The consequences were immediate. France was forced to scramble, turning to suppliers in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Canada. But these alternatives came at a heavy price. Global uranium prices spiked amid uncertainty. Contracts had to be renegotiated in haste, with far less favorable conditions. French industries braced for higher electricity bills, and households were warned of possible price hikes. Politicians sparred in parliament, blaming one another for allowing Africa to slip from France's grip. International observers, however, saw something larger unfolding. This wasn't just about uranium, it was about power. Niger, a country long dismissed as peripheral, had just demonstrated it could force Europe's second-largest economy to sweat. It wasn't the total collapse that some predicted, but the message was unmistakable. France was no longer untouchable in African capitals. The move was celebrated as a turning point. Editorials hailed Niger's leaders as bold. Crowds in Ouagadougou and Bamako marched in solidarity, carrying placards that read, "Our resources, our rules." The uranium cutoff had become more than an energy dispute. It was a symbol of Africa's long-awaited defiance. But beneath the celebrations and the panic, a crucial question lingered. If France had built its nuclear empire on the back of Niger's uranium, why had this vulnerability remained invisible to the French public for so long? To the average French citizen, nuclear energy was a source of national pride. School textbooks taught that France freed itself from the volatility of oil and gas by charting a bold path through atomic power. Politicians boasted that unlike Germany, reliant on Russian pipelines, France stood immune to energy blackmail. But Niger's uranium cutoff exposed a hidden truth. France's nuclear independence was never truly independent at all. The roots of this dependency go back to the 1970s. In the aftermath of the global oil crisis, France doubled down on nuclear power as the backbone of its electricity supply. But France's soil held no significant uranium deposits. To keep reactors running, it had to look abroad. That abroad was Africa. Niger, one of the poorest nations on Earth, became central to France's grand nuclear project. Companies like Arava, the predecessor of Orano, were handed long-term contracts that let France mine uranium under terms set in Paris, not Niamey. For decades, Niger extracted the mineral under deals widely criticized as neo-colonial. France bought uranium at prices that kept its electricity cheap, while Niger remained trapped in poverty. Mining towns saw little benefit beyond dangerous working conditions and radioactive dust, while French households enjoyed steady, affordable power. This arrangement was no accident. It was designed. France carefully disguised its dependence. Officials emphasized diversification, mentioning contracts with Canada or Kazakhstan. But Niger quietly accounted for roughly 1/5 of France's uranium imports, and this share was essential to keeping Paris lit. For Niger, resentment simmered for years. Successive governments questioned the fairness of the arrangements but lacked leverage. Paris wielded too much influence. French troops were stationed in Niger under the pretext of counterinsurgency. French aid was tied to political compliance. French companies dominated the mining sector. It wasn't until the 2023 coup, when the junta expelled French troops and tore up the old contracts, that the imbalance could finally be reversed. The secrecy surrounding the issue made the moment even more striking. While France declared itself an independent nuclear nation, it concealed that its sovereignty depended on Niger's uranium mines. Most French citizens could name Russia as Europe's gas supplier, but few realized their morning coffee brewed under a light bulb powered by Niger's uranium. Now that illusion had collapsed. The cutoff didn't just stop a supply line. It exposed decades of hidden dependency. France's image of nuclear strength, carefully cultivated for nearly half a century, suddenly looked fragile, even hollow. The energy independence it boasted to the world was built on contracts that an African government could revoke overnight. France's vulnerability was not bad luck. It was the result of years of denial. Yet, when Niger pulled the plug, France did not immediately collapse. Trains still ran, factories still hummed, Paris still glowed at night. Why? The answer lies in France's preparation. Though it never admitted reliance on Niger, its energy strategists had long anticipated political instability in the Sahel. France built strategic uranium stockpiles, enough to keep reactors running for months. It also quietly diversified suppliers in Central Asia and North America. These costly backup contracts softened the shock, but they came with consequences: higher transport costs, riskier geopolitical dependencies, and rising electricity bills at home. Uranium, stripped of its crown jewel, was hit the hardest. The company's stranded uranium in Niger was only the beginning. Its long-term dominance of Africa's uranium sector was gone. Investors grew nervous, and Uranium's decline became a symbol of France's waning influence across Africa. For now, France has survived by buying time, but stockpiles shrink with every passing week. Alternatives are expensive and fragile, and with global demand for uranium rising, France's long-term energy security looks increasingly uncertain. Meanwhile, the view from Africa could not be more different. In Niamey, Ouagadougou, and Bamako, the uranium standoff was hailed as a turning point. For the first time in decades, African leaders saw a former colonial power bend to their will. The balance of power was shifting. This wasn't just about Niger. Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traoré seized the moment, repeating his now famous words, "France needs Africa, not Africa needs France." In Mali, officials began revisiting gold mining concessions. In Guinea, leaders openly debated tougher terms on bauxite exports. Across the continent, the message was spreading. Africa could no longer be taken for granted. For African publics, the symbolism resonated deeply. For decades, protests against exploitative contracts were ignored. Now the proof was undeniable. A single decision in Niger had shaken one of Europe's largest economies. The leverage went beyond economics. By reclaiming uranium, Niger gained the ability to negotiate with new partners, Russia, China, or others. Where once France was the default customer, now multiple suitors waited at the table. This diversification marks a profound shift. Africa is no longer locked into dependency on Paris. Instead, its leaders are experimenting with multipolar diplomacy, refusing to let colonial legacies dictate modern trade. Of course, risks remain. Turning away from France does not guarantee prosperity. Much depends on whether revenues are invested in development or lost to corruption. But even with those challenges, the symbolic victory matters. For the first time in living memory, Africa is dictating terms. And for France, the damage is not just financial, it's reputational. Every time Niger holds firm, every time Traoré's words are quoted, Paris loses another piece of the authority it once enjoyed in Africa. The uranium standoff is becoming a case study in the decline of European influence. The colonial bargain is collapsing, replaced by a new reality in which Africa wields its resources as power. The larger question now is not whether France can keep its reactors running. It is whether Europe can adapt to a world where Africa refuses to be subordinate. The uranium crisis has shown that African states, united around sovereignty, can shake global powers and reshape the order itself. The story that began with stranded uranium in Niger ends with a much bigger truth. The age of Europe's dominance is fading. Africa is no longer just the world's resource basket. It is becoming a force capable of shaping the destiny of those who once ruled it. And as Traoré's words echo louder than ever, France needs Africa, not Africa needs France. What once sounded like a provocation is fast becoming the definition of a new age, an African century, where sovereignty, leverage, and pride are no longer negotiable. So the question remains, can France survive without Africa's resources? Or are we witnessing the true beginning of Africa's long overdue century?